Judith Butler obtuvo la licenciatura en Artes y los grados de maestría y doctorado en Filosofía por la Universidad de Yale. Desde 1998 ha impartido la cátedra Maxine Elliott en el Departamento de Retórica y Literatura Comparativa, así como el programa de Teoría Crítica de la Universidad de California en Berkeley. Judith Butler ha argumentado que el género está constituido por acciones y particularmente por el discurso. El género es un constructo social, no una esencia natural. Es la serie de actos que con constante repetición crean la ilusión de esa esencia natural. Con importantes aportes en los ámbitos de la teoría feminista, queer y los estudios de género, Judith Butler ha recibido 9 doctorados honoris causa de instituciones como la Universidad de Buenos Aires, la Universidad de Guadalajara, la Universidad de Belgrado, las universidades de Costa Rica y de Chile. Este año, la UNAM le otorgó el doctorado honoris causa. Con más de 14 obras de su autoría, destacan los textos Cuerpos que importan, El límite discursivo del sexo, Lenguaje, poder e identidad, Vida precaria, El poder del duelo y la violencia, y Deshaciendo el género, entre otras. Sus libros han sido traducidos en más de 27 idiomas. Pertenece a la Sociedad Filosófica Estadounidense, a la Academia Británica y a la Academia Estadounidense de las Artes y las Ciencias.
Pues aquí estamos con Judith Butler, nuestra nueva doctora honoris causa de la UNAM. Un lujo tenerla aquí y tener a ustedes con nosotros. Welcome, Judith. A real pleasure to have you here at the UNAM.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here.
How many times have you been to Mexico?
I suppose 5 times.
Really?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And always to the UNAM, of course.
So a couple of times to the UNAM, yes.
And a big public university like the UNAM, which still has free access to education. You know that the students aren't charged anything.
I know.
You realize that this is an exception in the world today.
Yes, it is an exception. I mean, I have been for some time a professor at the University of California at Berkeley, which calls itself a public university, but it is now funded primarily by grants and donations and private funding because the state has withdrawn 90% of the funding it used to offer. And it's still public, and in some ways it is slightly more affordable than other universities that are as large and as research focused as Berkeley is, but it is still impossible for many people to afford to go. We're in the United States, we live with this contradiction that a public university is too expensive for many students to attend. And in fact, I saw as tuition hikes took place that many of my own students decided to leave the university to go to more affordable community colleges.
Yeah, it's a real scandal. I think
it
it's
is a complete scandal. But you know, I mean, I would just add to this that if a public university is not accessible and affordable, then it is not public. I mean, it should no longer call itself public. It has betrayed the public mandate.
It hasn't been easy. On many occasions, the rectors have tried to start putting tuition, low-level tuition, to sort of get people used to paying. And even at that level, it's been massive student protests against them on 2, 3, or 4 occasions in the last few decades. So it's a real achievement of student activism from below. There's another interesting about U.S. Academy is that sociology, political science in general, doesn't often have a space for the kind of work that you do, or even philosophy, the traditional disciplines. You're in literature, correct?
I'm in literature and critical theory at Berkeley, and then I teach in philosophy sometimes at the New School and at the European Graduate School. So I'm in different disciplines depending on the institution.
when is the U.S. Academy going to wake up to interdisciplinarity as a norm?
Well, look, there are certain fields like ethnic studies, African American studies, gender studies that have always been interdisciplinary. And now, of course, even the sciences understand that you need multiple frameworks to understand certain kinds of phenomena like climate change. There is no way to understand it without a multidisciplinary collaboration. So yes, there are some departments that are more traditional and guard their territory, but it seems to me that the trend is going in the other direction.
Good, that's hopeful, because it just seems so compartmentalized and
it can be. It can be.
Especially for critical thinking. I mean, it's, for the more progressive voices,
yes.
Often they're expelled from the more traditional disciplines.
Well, we have a very large critical theory program at the University of California at Berkeley, and it admits students from all the disciplines, and it's a secondary degree you can get, and it's the largest one at the university. So that's
Wonderful.
A sign of something good.
Right. So here at the UNAM and in general in Mexico and the world, there's a intense debate within the feminist camp, right? Between feminists who are often get to the level of being separatists, right? And those who are putting into question the very idea of gender itself. And you've been in the center of this debate. And I'd like to hear your proposals, your ideas for how we can overcome this discussion. Not the discussion, but the conflict. Or maybe the conflict itself is positive. I think this is something that we'd all like to hear from you.
Yeah. Well, I'm just learning about the Mexican version of this debate. I know it in Spain, and I have seen it also in France, and of course in the UK it is perhaps most violent and occupies a great deal of public discourse. The first thing I have to say about it is that it's sad. It even breaks my heart because there are so many queer, non-binary, trans people who are feminists, who have always been feminists. And there are so many feminists who may well be identified with the sex that they're assigned at birth. They were assigned female, and they accept being a woman, and that is easy for them and right for them. But they also understand that that's not easy and right for everybody, that some people suffer by virtue of a sex assignment that is contrary to their very deeply experienced understanding of themselves. And it's especially important when we think about young people who very often suffer because gender norms are quite narrow, and they can't find their way with an accepted gender category that has been either assigned to them or has been taught to them through schools or through religious institutions or indeed through state policy. So it seems to me that feminism has always been against discrimination, for equality, against violence. And it would be quite strange to say that we're against all of those things, but only for women who are assigned female at birth, but not for women who have claimed that identity or that status over time. Or we're not in favor of all those, fighting violence, inequality, injustice, the lack of freedom. We're not in favor of fighting for gay and lesbian people, or for the indigenous, or for those who are imprisoned, or for those who are suffering intense poverty under increasing social and economic conditions of wealth disparity, right? Like it would be very odd to be, in a way, against discrimination and then to discriminate among those who should be protected from discrimination and those who should not.
I think at some level it's not necessarily against discrimination or in favor of discrimination in these positions. It's more look at particular cases, right? So like Leah Thomas, right?
Yes.
A swimmer, right? People feel that she is occupying, she's colonizing. No, a man is colonizing the space of women, right?
Yes, but
that would be there, and so it wouldn't be that they wouldn't be sympathetic to his or her suffering, but would feel that their struggles as women is being affected by this transgender passage. That's the kind of arguments that are offered, right?
Yes, I think those arguments are wrong. And I think they're very easy to make. I think they're too easy to make because it assumes that Leah Thomas is really a man rather than a woman, and that's a refutation of that person's lived existence. Okay, and that's no small thing.
Of course.
Right, it's like if somebody says to me, "You're actually not a Jew," which they have said, right, because of my politics on Palestine. You're not a Jew. It's like, who are you to tell me I'm not a Jew?
Right.
I mean, it's especially offensive if they're German and they tell me I'm not a Jew. It's like, you don't get to tell me if I'm a Jew or not a Jew. I mean, it would be very strange to take a fundamental category of existence and deny it to another human being. So, sports is in a dilemma. How do you not discriminate against somebody? At the same time, how do you take into account what may be an advantage that somebody has by virtue of what? Is it Leah Thomas's biology? Is it the anatomy? Is it the hormones? Is it what is it exactly we're talking about? Well, most people who work on sex determination, and here now we're talking about the biological sciences, understand that there's always an interaction between biology and social forms of life. So if somebody has access to a swimming pool every day because they're wealthy or because they live in a town where the pool is accessible, that person has an environmental advantage.
Of course.
And actually, the production of musculature will be different depending on your class background, right? So people like biologists like Anne Fausto Sterling have actually done a study of bones. Like poor people don't have the same bone structure, or those who are denied adequate nutrition, or those who are living in areas where environmental toxins are high, are going to have different lung capacity, different musculature, different bone density. So when we're talking about what is biology, we're already talking about a lived body that has been formed through environments and where the environment has interacted with hormonal levels, the growth of bones and muscles. We're talking about an interactive scene. So, for instance, there was a recent study that showed that testosterone levels actually don't correlate with athletic performance in the way that one might expect. So, several male athletes, and let us specify, assigned male at birth and kept that sex assignment through their lives, had very high testosterone levels, but their performance level was not as high as some other men who, with the same history, didn't have that testosterone level. Now, what accounts for that difference? So we're actually in a field of differences.
So just prejudice. People are being reductionist about it. Right.
The problem is that if we decide that somebody by virtue of anatomy or chromosome at birth, right, has an advantage. We are trying to distill or abstract that feature of embodied life as if it were never formed through interaction. But we are formed through interaction. It's why we have high levels of cancer in certain agrarian economies where insecticides have been used, right?
In California.
Or in California, right? I mean, we're foolish not to think in more complex ways about this.
Fantastic. I think that's very important to look at it that way.
And Leah Thomas doesn't always win.
Right.
Doesn't always win. It's like, well, what about the fact she doesn't always win?
Another case study to dig in, because I think this is the best way we can play out the implications of your theory. Anybody can read your books, but to have you in front of us to deal with particular issues, I think helps us a lot. In Spain, the big debate is about whether minors have a right to change their sex without even permission from the parents at the age of 12, 13, 14.
Yes.
That's divided the left in Spain itself in
I'm aware.
In a completely almost violent nature. I mean, it's really a big split that's being created. Is there a way of theoretically and practically overcoming that discussion in particular, or what's your position in particular on that issue?
Well, I'm in favor of self-identification, and I think it's right to debate when and how that can take place. I think it's an interesting debate. It's an important public debate. It is very possible at the age of 13 to decide that you want to change your sex assignment, and at the age of 17 to decide again that maybe you want to change it back. It's not as if when you decide forever. And sometimes there is a change that happens. But what's really important is that there be trans affirmative health care for young people who are struggling with gender norms that don't fit them, and who are trying to find a way to live, to breathe, to love, to move freely on the street, to feel at peace with themselves, and to move into a future with a sense of desire and hope, right? So I think that if a young person decides that that is the right thing for them, it is really important that parents and educational authorities and medical authorities open the way for that kid to find their way. And for us to say that we know better as adults, or that we're going to stop you from making a hideous mistake. It's not a hideous mistake. You can change your sex. You can also change it again, right? Let a person live. Let a person find their way. We would be making a mistake to impose restrictions on kids who are already suffering under restrictions imposed by very narrow gender norms, right? It's like, oh, let's add a restriction to the ones that they're already living under.
Right, if you're brave enough to make that decision, let's support that. Right?
But look, if we're going to talk about Spain, I mean, this idea of colonization, like, oh, trans women are colonizing the category of women. They're trying to take womanhood away from those who are assigned female at birth. It's like, actually, there is no competition. It's not a zero-sum economy. But I think it's a very intense fantasy. Like, if somebody who is assigned male at birth decides, because for profound existential reasons, that they want a legal status as a woman, that does not take away the womanhood of anybody else. Now, I don't think that the women who are afraid that trans people are going to strip them of womanhood or take it away from them I think they haven't thought about the fantasy that they are living under. It's an enormous fantasy. It's based in fear. I think it's also based on ignorance and possibly hatred. So it's a complex thing there. But they stoke fear, and they imagine that trans women are the ones they have to fear in life. But trans women are mainly women who have decided that masculinity is not their way of life. So they're not even listening to what trans women have to say about who they are and why they are as they are.
Excellent. We're going to go to a brief break,
Okay.
And we'll come right back with Judith Butler. Es fascinating. En español, me despido, perdón, amable público, aquí estamos. Ahorita regresamos con Judith Butler en unos segunditos después de un breve corte. No se vayan. Aquí seguimos con Judith Butler. Muchas gracias. Thank you, Judith, for your time, generous time, and for your visit here to the UNAM. To continue on with this issue of your expertise and knowledge of the question of gender and sex, then we'll go on to other issues as well. There's a big debate here in Mexico in particular about gender-neutral language. Spanish, of course, is a language that has, all languages, I guess, have genders one way or another, but Spanish compared to English is much more rich in its diversity of the use of gender. Sometimes when I hear people speaking gender-neutral, me as a person who grew up speaking English, I feel like they're destroying the beauty of Spanish itself and its flexibility of using different genders. With this attempt to sort of, almost I feel like they're almost as if they're speaking in English, which isn't so intensely gendered, right? They want to get rid of this flourishing, this diversity. But I think that's probably wrong. The problem is, in order to speak gender-neutral in Spanish, you have to say, use the feminine, the masculine, the neutral, the X. It becomes difficult to even speak. Right? What's your thought about this?
Well, first of all, I think there are movements for gender-neutral language, and in some cases, movements to feminize language throughout the Romance languages. So in France, there's a strong movement among feminist linguistics and linguists, and in Spain, obviously, there have been some public debates, and here as well, throughout Latin America, I think. And in Italy, although less popular there because of the deep cultural conservatism, and perhaps also the predominance of what we call sexual difference feminism. I think it's okay to be disturbed by linguistic usage. For instance, with pronouns, people assume that they make assumptions about you, they call you a certain pronoun, but they don't stop to ask what your pronoun is. And then if you tell them that you have a pronoun like they, I'm very often called they in the United States, but I don't impose it in Romance language contexts. There's a complaint, like, oh, that's complicated, how am I supposed to remember? And here are all my students and they have different pronouns, and what am I supposed to do, right? Now, it seems to me it's hard to remember the names of students and even their last names, and yet we do commit to that because we figure that the proper name belongs to that person, and you're trying to recognize that person. And if you make a mistake in class and you call that person by the wrong name, you will feel bad and you'll apologize later, and you'll tell yourself, remember what that name is, because you're seeking to respect that person and to recognize something about them. So if there's one more thing added, like call me he or she or they, it's not that hard. But the disturbance is interesting. Like, I almost feel like it's based in an idea. Can't I just take gender for granted? Can't I just live in a world in which there's masculine and feminine, and there's, elle and blah, and we just do that, and that divides up the world in a beautiful binary, and we know what we're doing, and it's easy, it's mellifluous, it's smooth. But sometimes language should become rough and even difficult, so that we rethink the presuppositions that we bring to our linguistic usage. How deep is our commitment to seeing the world as through the sexual binary? Everything is either masculine or feminine, and sometimes neutral. What would it mean to disrupt that, to try to also refer to people, not just as amigos and amigas, but as amigues, as a way of producing space for all those people who may be non-binary or really deeply offended by an assumed interpolation. You know, I mean, at the beginning of the civil rights movements, people said, you know, it's too hard to say black. We don't say black in English, right? You know, these have always been Negroes, and now we're supposed to say black? Like, how am I supposed to remember that? It's like, yeah, you're supposed to learn it now. And now, of course, we say it. We have debates whether it should be capitalized or not capitalized, but nobody would say Negro anymore unless they were a total conservative reactionary monster. Or talking about an historical period or reading a text in which that was historically appropriate. But there was big, like, well, English is easy for me and now you're making it hard.
Right.
It's like, that's right, we're making it hard.
Disrupting our
a little,
common sense.
Asking us to rethink like how profound our commitment to that binary is. And why do we think that's the way it should be?
Right. And it's a pedagogy of just every day.
Yes, and it's difficult, and you know, people resist, and now it works. But you know, for instance, there are parents who've come to me and said, you know, my daughter, well, she's always been my daughter, is suddenly saying that she wants to be called they, but I can't remember that because I've called this person she for 18 years. And it's like, why should I have to make that change? And I said to this one mother who came to me, your child is asking you to recognize them in a new way, and you have a choice. You can readjust and offer them recognition, or you can withhold recognition. And why would you want to withhold recognition from your child? Okay, I know, this is just my view, but...
Did you convince her? She was...
I'm not sure what happened afterwards, but it was a good conversation.
Excellent, thank you very much. Let's go to some of your more recent work. You've been writing a book recently about the pandemic, about COVID, which branches out into other topics. A more deep reflection on humanity and what we've learned from this pandemic. I would like to think that we've learned to be more humane, more sensitive, more solidarios is our word in Spanish, which I think is very powerful. But when you actually see what's happening on the ground in terms of the powers that be, financial, government, it seems that we haven't learned anything. What's your evaluation?
Well, I think that the pandemic did obviously make us realize that we live in an interconnected world, and in some ways COVID is a disease that belongs to our interconnectedness. It's because we breathe each other's air and we function in the same environment in proximity that we can fall ill. And the only way to eradicate that risk is through complete isolation. And even in the worst parts of the pandemic, that wasn't always possible for workers or for people who are unsheltered or for people who live in houses where many people live. So we have to, on the one hand, accept this sense of interconnectedness. We can't say under a pandemic that, oh, only certain people in certain parts of the world are being affected and others of us are not. That's an epidemic. We are all together in this, and yet we saw that as soon as the pandemic hit, there were certain kinds of inequalities that were intensified. We saw many workers who had to sacrifice their own lives in order to go to work, in order to make money, in order to secure the lives of those who are dependent on them. So we were in a classic Marxist situation where your work threatens your life, and yet you have to work in order to live. I mean, that was Marx's formulation in the 1844 manuscripts. And so we were returned, I think, to the brutality of capitalism. I think that has been exposed again and again. But also, obviously, the ways in which vaccines, instead of becoming public goods for which no one should pay, public global patents to which anyone has access, legal access, we got the corporate seizure by these major corporations that are profiting in appalling ways from this illness.
And from government money.
And from government money. No, I mean, we saw the deep connection between states and corporations. Their love affair has been secured for all time. And I also think we also saw intensified racism, like who has access to decent health care and who does not. Also, who is more vulnerable because they have never had access to decent health care, so more susceptible to a more serious form of the disease. And those statistics have been quite clear that white moneyed people in the global north fared much better than anyone else. So that's no surprise, but it also tells us that that interconnectedness that was a kind of potential of this pandemic has turned in many ways into intensified inequality. At the same time, we saw solidarity networks emerge. We saw forms of care emerge that were de-domesticated, that weren't just relegated to the household. We saw communities help each other. We saw more public forms of health care than we had before. And I think that ceasing to work so hard and ceasing to value production as this massive market value has been convincing for many people. Not everyone, but for many people.
It's been hard to get people to get back to work in many lines of the economy. That's really interesting. Yeah.
It is interesting. I think people were shocked at how well they felt being able to stay home or take long walks every day. And also being in odd forms of community, either online or under safe conditions. I also think that the form of interdependency that is highlighted by the pandemic is one that we need to consider in the fight against climate destruction, because in climate destruction, we are all equally implicated in it. It's not as if, oh, that's only happening in one part of the world and it's not happening in another. It is happening clearly in the Amazon as we see deforestation and extractivism maximized, especially under Bolsonaro. We hope that Lula will have the courage and principle to stop that, reverse that, and stop it. Okay, we presume he will. Let's say he will until
all power to Lula. Yes.
But and we also have a great government in Chile, which I hope will last. That is very much against trying to repair the damage of American exported neoliberalism that has been ravaging that country for so many decades. I think that the pandemic exposes this interdependency at a global level, which is not the same as market interdependency. It's not the same as globalization. And it gives us a way to think about forms of collaboration, even transnational covenants that can be made to not just control, but to reverse climate destruction. What does it mean for that to be not conducted by states exclusively, but by forms of transnational solidarity, organizations, civil society groups that are even outside of civil society as it's been constituted. These are forms of global solidarity that I find very moving and very hopeful.
Yeah, let's get back to the 90s of the anti-globalization movement. There was a lot of effervescence. Here in Mexico, the Zapatista movement. I feel like we're moving towards a moment in which this might start to happen again,
yes.
And it might be an inheritance of the pandemic. I'm just also seeing all the negative sides. I mean, the empowerment of these huge multinational social network companies, for instance, Zoom, Google, yes. Facebook, and well, Twitter's heading out the back door because of Elon Musk now, but they've become so hyper-charged through our now virtual life that I'm scared of that too. But
no, of course I am too, and I think many of the aims of the anti-globalization movement remain really important for us today. I think we shouldn't be relying on these media corporations to produce our solidarities, even though I understand we have to make use of them for various kinds of transnational communications. But to reclaim the global, the planetary, is extremely important for us, and we can't let capitalism be the only sense of the global. We need to kind of reclaim it, perhaps through the idea of the transnational or the planetary. I mean, all of these are very promising ideas that allow us to savor an interconnectedness and also be part of an anti-capitalism that will save the earth and very possibly many of our lives.
Wonderful. Let's take a second brief break. Ahorita regresamos para continuar con este diálogo pues, tan importante, profundo, conmovedor con Judith Butler. No se vayan. Aquí estamos de regreso con la doctora Judith Butler. Muchas gracias. Thank you, Judith, for
glad to be here.
Thank you. It's a privilege to have you. So let's go to your theoretical, your philosophical inspirations. Your PhD thesis at Yale was on Hegel.
Yes.
Right? Why did you choose Hegel, and how has he accompanied you all this intellectual journey, and what are the other must-reads for a young student who wants to follow your path?
Oh, well, I don't know. I think young students arrive at my work from different pathways, so I wouldn't recommend my own path. Maybe it's impossible to recommend one's own path. I certainly studied continental philosophy in graduate school. I studied in Germany for a little while, the history of German idealism, but also critical theory. So I attended lectures in Heidelberg, and I took the train up to Frankfurt to hear Habermas. So I've always had interest in that area. I became interested in French philosophy a little bit later, and the French reception of Hegel struck me as very interesting because whereas most of the Marxists were looking at Hegel and thinking about labor or society or dialectical method, the French were focusing on the notion of desire. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Why are they doing that? And since I was a young queer person whose desire was an issue, I decided to focus on that concept. And as you know, Hegel has this idea that desire is linked to recognition. not just that we desire recognition, but that the forms of recognition that are available in the world also have an effect on whether we can desire or how we desire or whether our desire will be speakable or knowable. So that became a kind of initial framework for me that I maybe brought into Gender Trouble without citing Hegel there. And that was a time when the AIDS crisis was quite urgent in the United States, and it was very clear that if you died from AIDS, you would not be given an obituary, and it was a source of shame at the very beginning. So there was a movement to claim the lives of those who had been vanquished by HIV, and to affirm their lives, to affirm their loves, to affirm their close people, whether their partners, their lovers. There was also an effort to establish networks of ex-lovers as kinship, rather than nuclear family. So these experimentations and these public manifestations were very important to my formation and my political thinking.
And that brought you into Foucault specifically, right?
Well, you know, Foucault was important to me in the late 80s and through a good part of the 90s, but probably hasn't been for about 20 years. I mean, I still read him, of course, but I wouldn't say, oh, I am a Foucauldian or something like that.
And Althusser?
And
Althusser?
Althusser, well, that was a great discovery, and in some ways it came late. I wrote about Althusser on interpolation, which was such an important concept for me in his famous essay on ideology in the state apparatus. And then, of course, I came to know Etienne Balibar, and I'm now much more educated in Althusser than I was when I was a younger person.
It's funny because when I went to college, I studied philosophy too. I studied continental philosophy, Hegel, Marx, Heidegger. We haven't mentioned Heidegger, which is another important piece of this.
Yeah.
And then I jumped to Foucault and Derrida. And I just missed Althusser completely.
Yes, I missed him too.
Until like 20 years later,
yes.
I picked up Althusser and I realized that this is like a lost grandfather or
yes.
last cousin. Like
I felt
now
the same
everything
way.
suddenly makes sense, right?
I felt the same way. And I felt very foolish that I hadn't. And Axel Honneth, to this day, he says, but Gender Trouble is Althusserian. I said, well, maybe it is, but I hadn't read Althusser. And he doesn't believe me. But it's the truth.
But it's fascinating because, at least in the US Academy, Althusser is seen as this sort of like Stalinist, right?
Yeah.
Determinist. And somehow he like escapes from the canon. And I think it's really important to look at. It's hard to understand Althusser, but it's important to read, right?
It is important to read. But he also opened briefly a window to psychoanalysis that was important, and made us rethink, you know, what we mean when we say we identify with something. Or he also allowed us to think about these institutions like church and education, or religious institutions more generally, how they form us and how they also fail to form us. In other words, they're not completely effective. He always made room for something called a bad subject who didn't properly conform to the norms that had been assigned to them. But I like to think that I went much further than he would dare to go in saying those norms can be contested.
I mean, he destroys the subject-object divide, relives Spinoza. I mean, that's what you're doing. In fact, I agree with this analysis. You were Althusserian before, well, even if you hadn't read him, because just rejecting these categories so commonly accepted and trying to bring us to a different viewpoint of humanity itself beyond the subject-object divide. I mean, that's the central lesson, at least for me, and that's what you're doing, obviously, every day in your work.
I hope so, in some ways. I mean, I think, though, we act as if the world is over there as our object, but in fact, it's already with us, and
Exactly.
the minute we're born, we're in and of it, and it's got us in its grips, and we have to figure out how to find our freedom and how to make our way.
Exactly.
So that part I do accept.
Wonderful. Any other contemporary scholars, perhaps, you would recommend to a budding philosophy major or grad student?
Well, I think that, I've had some very interesting conversations over the years with Catherine Malabou, for instance, and also Ernesto Laclau is a very close friend, and we had some good arguments, some strong arguments, and I learned an enormous amount from him. Well, there are just so many people, but I read widely, and I don't belong to a school. I've never made a school, and I don't belong to one.
Appropriate for your...
No, but I think we need to stay free of that kind of thing.
Wonderful. If we can circle back around to the gender topic, would be wonderful, because there's lots of interest in this and lots of a raging debate about it. I think is in the end positive. It might get overboard, but positive. In addition to the internal conflict between the transgender and the feminist perspective, we have a global neo-fascist attack on gender ideology, right?
Correct.
Which even goes by the name of anti-gender, which is interesting. It's actually anti-gender ideology, right? That's the idea. Where does this come from? Is it linked to economic, racial, colonial views as well?
Yes.
Or how can we unpack that?
Yes, well, one of the reasons why it's so difficult to assess this dispute between feminists and trans activists is that many of the arguments that the feminists are using are also the arguments that right-wing groups are using. And I fear that they may not know that they're making an alliance. It might be a kind of unconscious alliance with the right wing, or maybe they do know and they don't mind, which is all the more frightening. But the anti-gender ideology movement began actually with the Catholic Church and the Family Council, which was run by Joseph Ratzinger before he became Pope Benedict. And he issued a statement saying that gender was a very destructive concept and that it went against biblical teachings. And then in time, and that happened in the 80s and the 90s, and throughout the 90s, though, there was an alliance made between the evangelical right and the Catholic right. So they overcame their differences in their opposition to gender. And the fear, of course, was that gender is just something that people make up, and that sex is something that God creates. And if people are going to make up their gender, create it ex nihilo, they are robbing the creative power of God. And they're also destroying the idea of man, of woman, hierarchy within the family, the patriarchal order, and the natural and eternal status of the heterosexual family, by which I mean the family that is organized through heterosexual marriage. So the agenda is not just against the concept of gender, but the idea of gay and lesbian marriage, of reproductive rights for women, right? Women who claim to actually have autonomy over their own bodies rather than be subject to patriarchal control or state control. Single mothers, gay fathers, queer kids, trans adults, and forms of gender that are not restricted to the binary of man and woman. And even forms of feminism that claim that women are perfectly fulfilled without reproducing or having a child, or that men who don't assume a certain kind of dominant position within the family are still men. All of these social movements have been targeted under the idea of gender, and gender has been called diabolical or demonic. The current pope, and sometimes we expect better from him since he's been open-minded on some issues, but he continues to call it a diabolical ideology, and he means it literally. It comes from the devil, and it is the contemporary incarnation of the devil. So when we talk about a phantasmatic projection, like who is the devil? You know, I was burnt in effigy, apparently, in Brazil because I am the devil. Yes, yes.
Well, here we have a different
Yes,
image.
it's
Judith
nice.
Butler, look,
Yes,
from
it's
from
nice.
the Árbol de la Democracia, you can
It's more
learn
benign.
more about.
It's more benign.
Very nice. Well, we want to give this to you.
Yes, I love it. Thank you. Thank you.
So you visita el Árbol de la Democracia para conocer más sobre la obra de Judith Butler. I'm just going to make you a last question because they're calling the end to the show.
Okay.
Just want to know what's at stake with this. Why are they so afraid? Is it just that it's a psychological thing, or is this all about maintaining the capitalist colonial world order?
Well, I think I would say three things. Neoliberalism has decimated social services. So the church has intervened in order to take care of those social services, but so too has the family, which means that women are expected to return to their traditional roles as caretakers. And also, in a world in which there's climate destruction and mass migration, much of it forced migration, many people are afraid, many conservatives are afraid of losing their sense of national identity or their ties to local communities. They become xenophobic, racist, they're against gender, and they're against migration. So we have a sense of deep destruction, and there is deep destruction going on, and we can name what is actually destroying the earth right now, and it's capitalism, and it's corporate greed, and it's governments who are too complicitous with those forces to actually stop it. And yet that fear of destruction gets displaced onto all kinds of other minorities. So anti-migrant racism and anti-gender ideology are but two forms of that reactionary response.
Thank you so much, Judith.
Thank you.
We're going to have you back again soon to do UNAM, please. A real pleasure to
Lovely.
to have
Thanks
you.
so much.
Thank you very much. An honor, a privilege.
Great.
Muchas gracias a usted por estar con nosotros. Mira, aquí está Judith con su regalo de parte de nuestro programa Democracia de la UNAM. Y te esperamos de nuevo en 8 días para seguir dialogando sobre la democracia aquí en TV UNAM. Muchas gracias.